Okay, so good morning to those of you here, and if you're watching the recording, good morning to you as well. We're looking today at the Turnitin Blackboard integration, which has been trialled at CSU for the last 6+ months or so, when prior to that, as everyone would be familiar with, working at the institution, we've used a variety of different tools to deal with assignment submission, academic integrity, grading and feedback, etc. And so the purpose of this session really is for us to look at the pilot that has been trialled to date. And we've got a few guest instructors to talk to us about their own experiences using that integration. So we're joined by Kim Bailey from the Centre for Law and Justice Studies. We've got Kirsten Locke from School of Indigenous Australian Studies and Nicole Mahara from Faculty of Science. What's nursing called these days, Nicole? It's a pretty big one. SNPH something.
Yeah, something like that.
It's a big one. It's real big. We'll call it that. And welcome to all of you watching this as well. So look, what we're going to talk today about is just to provide a bit of context on the pilot, why it was brought in, what's involved in the integration, obviously how it works when we set it up. And really what I'm mostly interested in is hearing from instructors that have been using the Turnitin integration and those with questions about it. And probably of more interest to a lot of people is what's happening next. And that is far more interesting this time around than when we ran this session in 30, when the pilot was first running, because this tool will become available to everybody in session 90. So it has far more pressing implications, and we'll get into that as well. All right, so look, just a little bit of background around the implementation. Talking about text-based assessments, and the university has three kind of separate need areas that we've been dealing with disparate systems and processes to date. So assignments being submitted by students, text-based assessments, those have been going through EASE by and large. Grading and feedback to the students. The actual marks ultimately were needing to be manually put into the grade center, for example. The feedback might have been going back either attached to original documents back into EASE or through other mechanisms. And the academic integrity question, which requires a manual process, either by a course convener or individual instructors or somebody, hopefully, to batch download information either out of EASE or out of the grade center if they were doing another type of assessment, and then upload it into privately teacher-facing Turnitin portals, session by session, class by class, etc. For that process. So disparate systems, disparate processes. And the pilot and the use of the Turnitin integration brings all of those into the one space so that they don't have to be dealt with elsewhere. So it's predominantly about saving time, coming up with better ways of working, and freeing up teacher headspace really to be able to focus on the important stuff rather than, I suppose, the red tape. The pilot in session 60, the second time we've been running it, now involves all three faculties, 6 different schools, 137 subjects, and 254 assignments impacted. The number of students involved in that scenario was pretty close to about 6,000 at the moment. So it's about double the size that it was in session 30. We expanded the rollout really to gauge this session the support requirements, because we shifted the onus on creating the assignments back to the individual instructors rather than one person doing it all on behalf of everybody else. And by and large, that process has worked very, very well. And so that's I suppose, an eye into next session. What's going to be happening? It will be the same thing with more people involved in the support aspect where necessary. But all of this comes about really because inside CSU's academic integrity policy, we have a line that basically says all text-based assignments for coursework courses will be submitted and checked via the university's similarity checking software. So there's the line. We got to do it. And we obviously want to do it in a way that's least painful to all involved and most efficient. Okay, moving right along. The way that the process works is the instructor creates an assignment portal for each assessment that's going to be using a Turnitin match. They get the information from the subject outlines to do so. And then once the portal is created, the students go in there, they upload their assignments, and they're also able to keep resubmitting their assignments up until the due date to bring down similarity scores, etc., and learn from the process why scores are what they are, how that matching process works, and why hopefully along the way having conversations with their peers and with academics, etc., about the importance of academic integrity and their own efficacy in that space. Then we switch back to the marker perspective. Effectively, we hit the due date and then marking can begin inside the same location that the students uploaded their work to. There are different types of feedback possible within that space. We'll look at those. And then the grade flows back into the grade center. And then at the prescribed return date, again, from the subject outline, the students are enabled to view their feedback and their grade. What else have I missed? That's it. That's the last part. Okay. And we'll talk about that hidden and unhidden grade center column business in a bit. Behind the scenes, for those interested in the process, as opposed to the way we used to do things with giving students individual Turnitin class IDs and needing to create their own logins and join different accounts, none of that is required. They simply go into the folder in their subject site and they upload their assignment. So there's no account creation, anything like that involved in this process. It also consolidates all of those processes within one spot. And it also fits underneath this line about our academic integrity processes needing to be educative and student-facing. It's an important one, and we do revisit that quite often. And that fits under one of the lines in the policy that basically says we want it to be an educative approach rather than a punitive approach. And you can make of that what you will, whether or not it's happening in your subjects or not. But certainly the use of the portal, the assignment submission portals, and students being able to resubmit in those spaces is intended to be just as much a student-facing tool as it is an academic-facing tool. It's meant to work in both directions. Okay, I will get off slides in a second and start looking at actual portals and this process. But just to, I guess, bring us up to the present, we're at the point now where the majority of the subjects involved in the pilot for 60 are pretty much approaching or have passed their first assignment going into the Turnitin portals. And, you know, our questions at that point are around, is that consolidation working? Are the processes effective, saving time, making things easier for the academics, also for the students? Interested in whether or not students are resubmitting, are reframing their work so that they either bring scores down or engage in a drafting like process because of the portals. How do rubrics feature within this space, etc. And from a system side of things, we want to make sure that the portals are passing the grades backwards and forwards as they intend to. Right, so look, at this point in time, I'm going to stop for a second and probably introduce the first instructor for today to have a bit of a chat to us about her experiences today. And Kim Bailey, I'm going to throw you under the bus first, if that's okay, because really I'd like everyone to hear about your experiences, because you've been in the pilot since the beginning, since we got the Turnitin integration going, and you've had a number of subjects now in that space. You've also had involvement with with teams of markers, with peers in this space, with student feedback. And I think all of those things are absolutely valuable to everyone else here. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen really, and I would love to hear from you and potentially for you to share some of your experiences in this space, if that's okay.
Yeah, for sure. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm a big fan of Turnitin. I should put that out there right at the outset. I think it has saved me enormous amounts of time and my markers enormous amounts of time. Whilst there's a little bit of coming up the curve with the technology initially, like with any new tech, It's very user-friendly and intuitive for academic staff. And if you're working as a team of markers, I actually think we've got greater transparency in terms of parity of marking and therefore moderation. So completing quasar and actually evaluating whether we're on par with each other. So what I might do is share my screen and just, oh, sorry, Lachlan, can I share my screen? And just show you, I guess, a little bit of what we've been doing and experimenting. So I'm going to share with you, I guess, a paper which has been marked, and just show you some of the features that we were using in law. So we're very text heavy, as you can imagine. We also do actually have oral submissions, which we used through Turnitin this last session actually as well, whereby we actually had the students submit a document which had the link to their oral recording, which was made in Zoom, and we were able to give feedback then via Turnitin as well. So we actually had a repository system whereby it would integrate beautifully with the grade centre. And that was one of the things I particularly liked, was that there's no double handling of grades. I have a team of 5 markers that work with me in relation to this subject, and the students have a text type of a court document that they have to firstly annotate in terms of what's wrong with it. It's got plenty of errors in it for them to pick up, and then they have to attempt a redraft of the task into correct form in the subsequent part. What we did with our markers was I would initially send them a correct answer, so an answer guide, which was commented, and that we put into Google Documents because we found a shared space like that that was collaborative, enabled the markers to be feeding backwards and forwards to me any things that they were seeing or issues they required clarification on, or things I hadn't fully explained in my answer guide, which was really helpful. We then created a comment bank for feedback for the students. So my requirements of markers are that they give comprehensive feedback to our students, because our students really need to know what they're doing well and what they're not doing well in their assignment and where the marks have been graded. So the student gets this overall text comment at the end. But as you can see in here, whilst there's a summary of what they've done well or the main things they've missed, there's this little table here as well. All of the markers used this in this assessment task, and it was a great way of a checklist of saying, well, here's the key points of what we're looking for content-wise in terms of the high notes of how you're going to do well in this assessment. So we were able to actually indicate that by feeding it back to the student. This is where you missed parts. This is, and it saves you a lot of time repeating the same cut, paste comment. So that was a really useful tool that we adopted in this marking. We also created our comment banks, and you can see throughout the paper, the student not only had the global feedback, but they had these sort of comments here, and they were in our comment bank, which we created for this particular assignment. And we also have created one for each and every assignment. Now, a lot of our referencing system's truly heinous in law. A lot of the common referencing mistakes were added into the comment bank, a lot of the things that we normally would say to students, and we could just click and drag those comments over to the student in various parts of the paper, which was really helpful. What was great too with the comment banks is that if you go into your settings, you actually can create the bank here yourself, but then you can actually export the set and share it with your other markers, so that we're all using the same expressions or the same referencing errors or whatever it is that we wanted to feedback collectively to students. So if you have a marker whose tone might be a problem, and we have had those in the past, you can actually do a lot to help I guess educate your marker or assist your marker by giving them a set comment bank like this, which I found was incredibly helpful. So my markers were really happy to use that, and found that really helpful in the marking of the papers, that quick dragging of comments over. Other thing that we did, which I really loved, particularly with the oral feedback, we didn't do it in this task, but we did do it in the further tasks in the subject, was that we actually had a voice recording for the student feedback as well up here. And I heard something at one of these PD sessions in relation to helping students digest feedback, that students who fail often don't query their marks or don't get as upset with respect to their failure if they receive audio feedback. There's some weird relationship between hearing the voice teacher presence in a kind way, saying, look, thank you for your paper. I can see that you've tried here, but here's the reason why the paper doesn't meet passing grade. And so we started implementing that with respect to the fail papers, and really interesting, didn't get a lot of pushback from students that I normally would in relation to a fail paper. And believe me, law students love to challenge fail papers. So that was an interesting thing to do as well, was to use the voice comment recording. We also highlighted the rubric for the student as well, so that, oh, no, can't see it. No, there it is. So the student could actually see the marking rubric, which was in the subject outline, as to where they fell in the rubric.
It's on another
well.
screen, Kim.
Oh, is it? Right, sorry. Start sharing that again. There we go. So in one assessment task, the student's actually getting quite an extensive amount of feedback, but the time it takes to create that feedback is actually less than what it used to take me downloading from EASE, typing things in, cutting and pasting, uploading again, and so forth. So even if we marked with Norfolk, and I know there is voice recording in Norfolk, it was absolutely quicker and more seamless here. The other brilliant part about it was that I could actually see live how my markers were going. So if a marker was falling behind, I could see if they hadn't actually marked the papers. If I was concerned about parity with one marker, I could dive into their papers without needing to share documents with each other and just actually see how we're marking. So I'm a big fan.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Kim. And now you've probably been using this in what, 3 subjects, I suppose, since between 30 and now.
So yeah, it's actually 5 subjects now.
5. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So you've had a bit of exposure to it all, and moved across to setting them up yourself as well, obviously in that time, and having everyone around in the same school also using the same process. I can remember quite distinctly in the early stages of the pilot getting some feedback from different student groups that had, I don't know about expectations, but let's just say when a new process was introduced, they were more than happy to verbalize on how much they disliked it compared to the old way. You know, we want the old way of doing things. Why are we doing this? And it probably comes down to the fact that some of them were in subjects where they were using different submission methods, still using EASE or doing other things. Some of them were then having to go into other subjects and use Turnitin. And so there was an inconsistency in the process, and also some confusion about the way that students independently access Turnitin up until now. So they have access to a thing called Check My Assignment, which is a tool through the student portal that they can get access to submit their assignments, just to get a score. It's not saved anywhere, but it's an independent check. And so you've got all these different experiences prior to that about why they would use Turnitin, what it's for, and not necessarily connecting it to grading, feedback, and also anything beyond just getting a score, getting a number. And now that process has become somewhat more meaningful in this space.
I think that's right. You have to really bring your students along with the journey as well, because don't assume they know how to use Turnitin. They actually don't know how to read similarity reports, the vast majority of them, even though we have an academic integrity module, they don't know how to read their reports. So taking a students through this before they submit an assignment and actually showing them how the portal works, how the feedback will be given and the different types of feedback is actually a valuable exercise in helping students understand the technology as well.
I noticed you were also talking about audio feedback there, the commenting available in Turnitin, and I have collected some more feedback this session. Just recently, in and around, there are a couple of markers that are using it again. It's probably one of those steps that people will get to when they get either more confident in the space or have a particular task type that's going to benefit from that type of feedback. So before I show an example of that, I can see Brendan's got his hand up.
Yeah, just on from that, Kim, when you explain it to the students, do you guys use like a dummy version or something, or something that we can practice on an assessment task rather than the live documents? Because I'm finding when I talk to some of the young markers too, that they want to have a play around with the system, and I'm just wondering what's the best way to be able to encourage that with our marking team, and then I could probably potentially use that as a learning opportunity for the students too.
Submit your own as a student. If you log in as a student and go into the portal, and submit your own attempt, if it's, you know, legitimate or not, but then your markers will be able to go in there as instructors and also grade that. and play around with it. That's what I'd be
Yeah,
doing.
perfect. That's a good idea. So I can just lodge something under my username and it'll come up as me. Perfect.
So sign into the i2 site using the student preview, then go in through the assignment portal the same way your students do. Yeah. You may need to click on the settings, the student preview settings bit, and make sure that it's keeping the data. If
I've been able to get that blue box up for the students
Yeah.
as the students things, but yeah, it's a great idea. I never even thought about that. So I like that idea. Yeah.
No problem. You could even label your submission as instructor playground or something. I don't know, whatever you might do. So anyway, here's one of the comments, I guess, that we had in that space around using the audio comments. The fact that they obviously like using it. The students found it positive and that they're highly critical of their own work, and sometimes the written feedback doesn't give them the depth of feedback. I suppose that's going to depend on the instructor and the feedback they put in. And that switching that modality, the recorded message, can help to grow confidence, etc. That might not be possible through the written word. I think the best thing might be to actually show you some of those audio comments. We'll have a listen to some of those just to see what they look like. So I have got access to one of them. Let's have a look here. All right, so if we have a look at this first assignment these students have submitted, it's a PowerPoint task. Again, this is important to note that if there is text in the submission, they can submit different file types, don't just have to be Word documents, as long as there's text in the submission. So these were presentations where the students submitted their slides after the fact, after they'd done their presentations. Into the Turnitin portals, we'll open up the Turnitin dashboard. The marking has concluded. Students have received their feedback. What we can see here is all of the student submissions. Each of the columns is sortable. We get a timestamp of the submissions, red indicating that it was late, past the due date, but they can still submit. Then we go across and see that the grades have gone in. We also get similarity scores, etc. I think for this type of task as well, if it's going to be PowerPoint slides where they've duplicated a lot of the messaging, you're going to get higher scores, obviously. And interestingly, what this tells me is that the grades haven't been released back to the students yet. So the marking has concluded, but the grade center column hasn't been made available, and we haven't hit the release date because this column, the viewed column, none of the students have looked yet at their results. That's why we're getting this black eye with the line through it. So we're kind of just about probably at that date before the academic makes these available to the students. But if we jump into the actual grades on the paper, same process the marker would go through, clicking on grade. And as you saw with Kim when she was sharing her screen, you have the student submission on the left that we can scroll through. In this case, we're getting PowerPoint slides. The section we're interested in at this point in time are the marking or the grading tools. And if we expand that out, we get quick marks if they're using quick marks. And Kim was showing you her collaboratively sort of built quick mark set that can be dragged and dropped into the student paper. Then we have the, I guess, the summative comment, if you will. And what we notice here is that the academic has used voice commenting, and that comment can be played back here. But the actual text comments, they've just provided inside the actual paper itself. So they've literally clicked inside the paper and been able to annotate at that point. And I'm guessing because this is a presentation that they've done in person and that we're just checking the slides as the text backup for marking, etc., you'll find that there will be commentary against each of the slides put in. And those are the notes underneath, I think, that we were seeing underneath the slide deck. So when we get these, for example, they won't be, this will be the slide, this will be the notes from the slide. And if you're familiar with PowerPoint, if you export your PowerPoint slides as a PDF, you are given the option to capture the notes from the PowerPoint slides within the PDF as well. But anyway, we're interested in the voice comment at that point, so let's have a listen to this one.
Amy, thanks for a high quality presentation. I really enjoyed the way you laid everything out. It was very clear, yet you had the depth in your notes section, which covered off on most of the areas that we were after. Probably the only area I think you need to improve on was looking at the external research that can continue to reinforce the rationale, the information from the NESA syllabus. But it was fantastic. I think as a graduate teacher, this is a really fantastic way to get a good understanding of each of the syllabus and how.
All right, so you get the idea. That commenting process was able to be done, by the marker relatively quickly, obviously, but it is personalizing what can sometimes be an otherwise quite dry experience, the online experience, particularly if all you're getting is either text feedback or potentially even just a rubric with stuff highlighted. Speaking of rubrics, clever segue right there. We've got one underneath here in Turnitin. We have the rubric tool. We're presented with a consolidated view of that, quite condensed. We can expand it by clicking on the crosshairs. And at that point, we can see that the student submission, in this case, it's a qualitative rubric. So that just means the instructor just has to click on different cells and it will highlight that for the student and they can see where their submission attempt sat. And obviously the other types of feedback provided alongside the rubric form the complete picture for the rubric, for the feedback. All right, and then you can see that on that kind of condensed view, the students achieved a high distinction in this case, with the grade manually being put up here at the top. This is before we consider questions in and around academic integrity and the student submission for Turnitin. We can still open up all of those areas and start engaging with the student submission and the originality of the paper. So that is a fairly quick look at the student dashboard when submissions go in. Another part of the dashboard for the markers is the ability to draw up, to bring up an analytics tab. We were looking at that right at the beginning of this session for those of you that joined early. Here's a look at the analytics tab for a previous assignment that you can bring up, and that will give you a look at some of the information in terms of, your students that have submitted on time or after the due date. That's obviously going to line up with how many got extensions and other things. But the Turnitin integration in this system does not. It talks to Blackboard in terms of bringing the student details in and feeding the grades backwards and forwards. That's it. So there's no handling of extensions or other processes, moderation, SAMs, all those other things through this platform. It simply allows you to get your full list of your students from the subject site and send the grade back into the grade center when it's complete. So quite often I get questions around, well, how am I going to handle extensions with this? It's like the same way that you've always done it. This doesn't handle those for you, but it does show you which students submitted after the due date. So it'll also give us some insight into the spread in terms of similarity scores for the submission, where those submissions are generally coming from, where the matches are coming from, either from internet matches or other submitted papers to the Turnitin Global Repository or from publications. Interestingly, we were talking about submissions before, 73 submissions from the cohort in total. Our lovely donut here suggests that that's most of them. We only missed a couple. And there might be, withdrawals or other things going on in that case. But anyway, most of them submitted the task. And then we look at how many of those students actually resubmitted their work multiple times. So drafting, bringing their scores down. That's interesting. How many of them looked at the feedback for this task after the fact? So 67 out of 73, that's interesting. And that after we made it available, how long before they did that? So the dashboard's interesting to me anyway, to give me a bit of a snapshot into how students are engaging with the platform. And, that was for a relatively small cohort. I'm really interested to see what this looks like this session when we've got such massive cohorts of submissions as well. I think it's probably an opportune time to introduce our second instructor here this morning, Nicole Mahara from nursing, paramedicine, health science, etc. Because Nicole's been using the Turnitin integration this session, and I'm interested to hear about your experiences, Nicole, in comparison to what Kim was saying about hers. Can you tell us a little bit about your cohort and how you found this experience?
Yeah, hi, sure. So I certainly don't have the extensive feedback Kim has. That was amazing, and obviously a lot more experience. I started the Turnitin, I think we had training the week that I actually had an assessment due. So I had a very short turnaround. So my cohort that I did the first assessment with, there's only 19 in that cohort. So it's a small group, which was great. But because I didn't have a lengthy period of time to sort of play and fiddle with it, I actually went off the instruction sheet that we were provided during the training session, and that covered pretty much everything I needed to do. It just stepped me through the process. I think there was a couple of questions I had for Lachlan when something didn't go wrong, but they were very simple and minor things. We had it up and running in time for the first assessment, which was great. I think, as Kim mentioned, I liked the fact, and I'm a big fan of Turnitin. I really enjoyed using it for the first assessment. I've got a second assessment due this week. And I liked it because, as Kim mentioned, you don't have to go between Easts, between Grade Centre, cutting and copying, pasting stuff out of Word. And it just, I found the old system quite clunky in comparison to what Turnitin was able to do once you got it into the system. I also utilised the video recording for the students as well to enable them to understand how to submit their assignment, and I didn't have any issues from that. So everyone was able to, again, in a very short turnaround, was able to submit their assignment with no issues. I think we only had one person that had an issue, and it was because I hadn't unticked or ticked a box or something. So we were able to sort that out pretty quickly. I used to utilize the rubrics to put in the marks, but because it's a qualitative rubrics, the way around it was, as Lachlan has on the screen, I just did a criteria 1 to 5 as per the rubrics that was in the subject outline, and actually put the marks in there so that the student could actually see individually where they sat, because again, I'm a fan of high credit or low credit, just so you kind of know where you were sitting on the scheme of things. I did include the rubric in the Turnitin as well, but it basically just used it as just a grading system, just so that you could sit and see where they sat within the grades. And so then I just had the Word document there to copy into the comments section. Yeah, I like the fact that I can see that when the students have accessed their results. So there was only one student that hasn't actually viewed their results. I liked the easy format of putting in feedback. I didn't use, like Kim did, I didn't use the comment bank much, but again, I didn't have a huge amount of time prior to the first assessment. So I'm hoping to develop that into future assessments, because again, I can see the value of that, whereas I've just made comments and provided feedback individually, so that I can see saving more time into the future as well. There's obviously still a lot of learning for me to do, but from my first use in it, and also new to sort of, I suppose, academia and doing this. So I've only been in academia here for 8 months now. So again, I have marked for a while, but so I could compare the marking. But for me, in future offerings, I can certainly see the benefit of what Kim mentioned with the comment bank and with multiple markers, which with a cohort of 19, it's just me. So it was easy and simple, this one. But yeah, so I've really enjoyed it, and like Kim, I'm a fan of it as well.
Thanks, Nicole. And I think that's exactly the type of scenario that we want to hear from as well, in terms of people that are relatively new in this space with a new process and new system to get across, and being able to take all that on board relatively quickly and easily. And as you said, we can see here the majority of your students have looked at the feedback as well, have gotten that. Which is great to know. We can basically open up your analytics tab as well for the task, and that'll tell us basically they all submitted before the due date. So congratulations there. I don't know that anyway. I think you've probably made everyone in the room jealous at that point, which is quite a unique scenario. But we also can see a bit of a spread in terms of the similarity reports, that students by and large had looked at their feedback inside 16 hours after it had gone in. And that, again, we're getting close to that a third of the cohort sort of thing had looked at, had resubmitted or drafted work and resubmitted, which is interesting. So yeah, look, I think it's great to hear. And that process as well, I mean, you mentioned a video for the students, which we put into getting started into all of the subjects, and that will be in every subject site next session as well, where we're talking is sort of a 5-minute walkthrough for students, just looking at that experience, what it looks like for them, of just going into the assessment folder, clicking upload and uploading their assignment. We want this process to be as seamless and streamlined as possible. So thank you very much for sharing your insights into the process, Nicole.
Yeah, thank you. And that reminded me, that was one of the comments, was the resubmission. That was where I hadn't ticked a box or something, and it was really it was a tick box as to what the problem was there. But otherwise, it was yeah, great. I love it.
And I think it's a really good point, is that you've got to be realistic with any new process at scale as well, is that there are tricks basically to doing this effectively that people learn over time, and you can expect that you're probably going to need to do it a few times, like riding a bike, I suppose, and then it becomes first nature. Brendan, you've got a question.
Yeah, just one question on the resubmissions. If you were to mark the paper and then that person resubmits, what does that look like?
Ooh, that's an excellent question. Let me tell you firstly that it doesn't look like anything, because they can't resubmit once you've started the marking process, because what will happen at that point is if you were to upload on behalf of the student, it would let the instructor do it, and that actually would wipe any of the feedback and the grading at that point. So it's a really good question, and it's also why we have very hard and fast kind of rules about students being able to resubmit until the due date, and then no resubmissions, and our marking process not able to commence until that due date has been hit, because of exactly that reason. And we've had exactly that scenario crop up this week, where we had a system outage last Friday. We had some students who had submitted prior to that point, and then when there was a system outage on the day the task was due, the system was out for 2 hours, which I've never seen before, but it happened with technology systems. You know, it will happen at times. So a ruling was made at that point that all the students could have the weekend, you know, and not to worry about it. Don't get stressed. You can all have the weekend. So they pushed the submission date forward. But in the interim is a marking team, a cast of thousands in the marking team, who've begun their marking process on the weekend. And they've already marked a whole string of the student submissions. And those students who had submitted had all thought, well, I've just been given the whole weekend to do as many more attempts as I want to. And they wanted to resubmit, but the marking had already been done. So at that point, we have, you know, attention to resolve. And it's going to go one of two ways. One of them being, we told all the students they could have the weekend, which means that the marking will have to be redone and the students allowed to resubmit. Or you've already submitted, we reached the time, we've done the marking. I'm pretty sure I know what position the school would take on it, but yeah.
How did the students know they couldn't submit?
They wouldn't physically been able to resubmit because the initial due date had been reached.
Because the initial due date has been reached. So if, say, you marked it early and then I start marking that paper, how would they know then that they can't submit then?
That when they go into the Turnitin portal, it would take them to their submission that was already in there, and it wouldn't give them the resubmission box.
box. So, okay. So as soon as you touch that document, but so does that document have to have a result in grade center for it to be saved? Like,
No,
so,
I mean, it's a separate thing. So the grade from Turnitin would pass through to the grade center once you've put in the final grade at the top. That will happen usually relatively quickly.
yeah. Okay.
It's not that you can't change it. It's just that it creates
A bit
that
of issue.
complication.
Yeah. I'm just thinking out loud only because if we were to do some moderation papers and then mark the moderation that have submitted early, and then that person then decides to resubmit their paper, then does that moderation paper get removed, or does that person obviously then can that person not submit again because that paper that we use for moderation has been marked through Turnitin?
Once it's been graded, the feedback is in there, they can't resubmit.
They can't resubmit. Okay.
Right. Now the workaround essentially is at that point you as the instructor could remove it altogether. Maybe you've downloaded a copy of the feedback, etc., or kept a copy of the original marked paper. But in terms of the portal, the student is not going to be able to upload another assignment in here whilst that original one is there. Yeah. No, I mean, there's some interesting kind of troubleshooting scenarios to look at with how the process works. Yep, Nicole.
So just that sort of makes me now question, so moderating papers, so I have to do my next assessment with moderation. Maybe Kim or you might be able to help on this one. So what is the best way to have the second person moderate the paper for the ones, you know, that have submitted? So is it better to download the paper and moderate offline, or can you explain how to work that one through, please?
Yeah, it depends on your policy for your school, but what I will normally do is, in accordance with our policy, we will download some papers through your download options, the three little dots on the side, and blind mark a couple, so that you've got parity between markers to make sure that that's there. And that's a little laborious, obviously, because you're not marking in the Turnitin system, you're marking a script. But for moderation purposes, that's okay. I will also go through and I'll moderate by every fail paper. So I'll actually sometimes even clear the grade or hide the grade up at the top and go through and consider whether I think the marker's been fair in their comments as against the marking guide, and moderate it that way. So, but yeah, that's the one tricky bit. Once it's marked, it's hard to not see what's already in there. So you kind of need that script.
Yeah, thank you.
From a technical side, I would add that your window for making change is your feedback release date. So what that means is that even if you've gone in that 2-week period, for example, let's assume that your moderation has got to happen inside your 15-day turnaround as a starting point. So that means that even though you might have initially had someone go in and grade inside the portal and it's done, as long as you're before the actual return date to the students, doesn't matter. Student can't see it, right? That's the important part, as long as the student can't see it. So we get back to our grade center columns being hidden when we do the setup properly, is that you can have another instructor go in there and then turn around and go, right, well, I'm going to change the original one, or I'm going to provide additional comments, or do whatever they need to do with that. This is not going to be available to the students. The feedback is not going to be available to the students until that date is hit. So you can absolutely do your moderation inside here if you need to, as long as it's inside that window. Yeah,
that's absolutely right. So if I have new markers who haven't marked with me before and I want to check their work before it goes back to the students, I'll give them a different deadline before the release date. So I've at least got 3 days up my sleeves to go through their marking and make sure we're all on the same page. So yeah, sometimes getting your markers to get it back to you before the release date can be really helpful.
Thanks, Kim. And Jen's asked a question about attachments inside Turnitin itself with the feedback. It doesn't let you do attachments, but it'll basically has a very simple sort of editor that allows you to do a couple of things, really, not a whole lot. You can copy and paste in there, you can link, and you saw before with some of the feedback from Nicole and the others and Kim, they were using tables. So they've created a table in Word, for example, and pasted that inside their feedback. capture table type data as well if they needed to do that. So there's an example of that being done there. That's just been copied and pasted from Word, and that's basically the way that all of Brendan and Nicole's school is marking this session.
I've seen some people do the strike through with a red pen. Do you know how to do that?
A strike through with a red pen in these comments?
Makes very in the papers, on the papers, not the comments here, in the paper.
In the paper itself?
Yes.
Okay, well, commenting we can do. Strike
so not in
throughs.
the comment. It was like someone didn't like, say, the maybe American term or something like that, or they didn't like the word or something like that, and they were able to strike through it. Oh, there. It's
to highlight. Left
highlight
click.
it, and
Left
then
click.
hit the S.
Left click and
cool.
drag to highlight, and then
Perfect.
you can hit S.
Thank you.
To do the
nice.
strike through.
Thanks a lot. There you go. Cool.
See, we learned something new.
You
So-
could theoretically, if you wanted to include an attachment in the comments, is you could create a Google document and put the link for the Google document in. That's one way you could do it.
Yeah, there's actually a couple of workarounds for that. One of them is thinking beyond Turnitin and thinking where this goes to. Ultimately, the student gets their grade in My Grades, so the grade center. And if we actually look at the grade center in a subject, you can add attachments in the grade center to a student's grade. So
I
if we have a
actually
look,
found it really useful in Grade Center, that exclamation mark there as well, so that you
That's
can,
right.
because I actually picked up that someone had submitted it in assessment item 2 as opposed to assessment item 1 by just looking through Grade Center, and it was able to then flick that person an email and say, hey, look, heads up, you've put it on the wrong assessment item when you've attached it. So yeah, I found that useful.
it's a good point. And so the integration with Turnitin shows us when submissions are starting to come in, just at a snapshot sort of view from here. Not to put you on the spot, Nicole, but I can see your grade center column's not hidden for this second task. Would you like me to hide it for you? Yeah, okay. That way, and the students won't get the grades. So what I was talking about before, when we have the student's attempt here, it's linked to Turnitin. Clicking on the grade in here, or the student clicking on the grade in My Grades, would open up the Turnitin Feedback Studio and their submission, their mark, their feedback. Next to it, we're also able to, if we click on, I just have to remember which one. I think maybe it's quick comment. No, that's not the one. View grade detail, I feel like actually opens up Turnitin. No, it doesn't. Excellent. Okay, so viewed grade detail at this point, you can in fact click on edit the grade. It doesn't change the number necessarily, but you can then add attachments, right, using the editor here, and that will attach to My Grade, and the student will be able to then have attachments with their feedback. But we're getting outside of our comfort zone of everything just in Turnitin inside that editor. So if you're comfortable working with the grade center and other bits and pieces that can happen in this space, you can certainly add attachments in here, but it's an extra process. Sorry, Brendan.
Just another question. Like, say for example, we forgot to allocate a late submission and remove some marks from the person's paper because they've submitted late there as well. Do we have to do that in Turnitin, or can we just do it from Grade Center? Like, do we have to do it in both sections? So
Can you ask me that again?
Okay, say I had a marker mark it, and then I forgot to send them who was submitted late, and I wanted to remove 10 marks from that person because they were 2 days late. Rather than me going into Turnitin, do I have to go into Turnitin and change their grade in Turnitin, or can I just change it in Grade Center?
Look, I can tell you the way that it's supposed to work.
Okay.
Firstly, which is that if you do it in Turnitin, it'll flow through to the grade center. If you adjust it in the grade center, it will flow back into Turnitin.
Oh, okay. So it talks to each other.
That's how it's supposed to work. You know, I'm not going to pretend that I haven't seen instances where it hasn't worked in that way, and that the grade center hasn't flowed back into the portal in a couple of cases. I've seen it do both. And so that's why I'm kind of loath to say it will always work, and that's the way that it my standpoint, I guess, is I would default back to Turnitin and make the change there, just to be sure, because I know it works in that direction. Yeah, that's a really good question. Jen's got a comment in there about the audio feedback only being 3 minutes. We can't increase it at this point in time, unfortunately. Yeah. It's interesting when you actually record yourself talking for 3 minutes. It seems like an eternity for some people. So yeah, I completely take your point. You got to manually change the grade is to your next question that you've got in there. If we have to manually adjust grades for penalties, etc., it still has to be done manually. Yeah, it doesn't talk to any of our other systems or processes in that respect, but the grade would have to be manually adjusted. Yeah, so there are affordances, swings and roundabouts in terms of the efficiencies that we get. And it saves a bunch of time in terms of the academic integrity process. That is the big obvious affordance, time saving wise, particularly. And the bigger your cohort, the bigger that saving is going to be in terms of time. Some of the other hiccups that we have had along the way. Obviously, there is a massive scope in terms of the way that our markers approach their feedback, how they use rubrics or not, the types of feedback they provide, the volume of the feedback they provide, whether they're wanting to use a quantitative rubric to determine grading ultimately. Turnitin has some limitations in that space. It's quite restricted. Which of those 3 initial priorities that we talked about, if I bring those up, are most important, or are they equally important? For some people, the academic integrity question makes all of this worthwhile. So that's what I mean by priorities. So in terms of being able to deal with the academic integrity process without having to go into separate systems and processes and downloads, etc., makes everything else, a far lesser concern. It's worth manually setting those things up. For other people, not having to set up Turnitin portals is their priority. And so they will continue to use ACE as long as we have ACE. And that's simply a fact of people's different priorities in this space. So let's talk for a moment, if I'll just look at some of those other hiccups, and then I'll get on to where we're heading with this before we wrap up. Student ease of access has been raised for me, like people saying, well, students are used to using ACE and any type of change of process is a problem, and we don't want them to have to learn this. I would argue that this system is just as easy as using ACE, as long as the setup is done properly. In fact, having everything related to an assignment all available inside the one assignment folder for each task, to me, is as simple as the process can get for students. The submission point, the related documents, feedback on how the marking is going to be handled, for example, all related information, all within the one spot, is a far better efficiency than perhaps sending that having some information, for example, the subject outline, so the submission portal over in ACE, for example, related documents and support materials and cover sheets in another folder somewhere else. We don't need to deal with that kind of disparate process when we use this process. So that's, I guess, my response to that question around accessibility for students. When students have used Turnitin independently through the Check My Assignment tool, they get an email notification afterwards, automated. Turns up saying, here's the confirmation of your submission and your score. This process does not do that. They have the ability to get an electronic receipt when they upload. They get a green notification bar across the top that says, right, it's been successful. You can get your receipt here. They have to manually click on that. They get the receipt, but it doesn't automatically email them a notification. And some people have commented on that. I like the old way where I got an automatic email. The syncing of the information between Turnitin and the Grade Center has been commented on because it is not instantaneous. It can take somewhere between instant and several hours, depending on how long that information flows backwards and forwards. So we're aware of that not being instant, but that comment has been made. We do not have the ability inside Turnitin necessarily to track the turnaround time from when markers have provided their feedback to students. With ACE, heads of school, etc., are able to request a report be generated for them that will show how quickly markers have returned their grading. So that functionality is lost in this process, and arguably you can go into the Turnitin portal and see when the feedback has been, when the marking has happened, and that the students have received their feedback by the date, but it is a manual process rather than a report that can be generated. So that's something to be aware of. When we don't have the grade center columns hidden, up until the release date, students see your grades and their feedback, just the grades, sorry, instantly. And that is a problem. Obviously, our 15-day turnaround is there for a reason. We've got moderation. We've got all sorts of things that can happen in that space. So we have to make sure the grade center columns for the task are hidden until we're ready for students to see them. And then the last one is where we have group assignments. This tool does not handle groups, clusters of students as such. It is provisioned against every student's login. So that means every student generally is required to log, to make a submission, and we provide their grades and their feedback back to each individual student. How it handles the idea of a group work assignment, well, it doesn't really. You might only get one person from within the group uploading the group's attempt or something, but then you at some point would have to manually go in and provide a mark to each other student. Right now, we don't have an effective tool either in I2, EASE, or anything else that handles group work submissions effectively. So there's no answers to that scenario in here. It has to be manually handled. All right, let's talk very quickly about what's next. Turnitin will be turned on and visible, available to all academics to set up assignments in session 90 on. So it will be a choice at the point that has to be made when the subject outlines are being drafted for the subject. Will the submission method for this task be Turnitin, EASE, something else? So that choice will be available. EASE will continue to be available at least until, well, I would say until we go to a new learning management system. At that point, it's not going to be available any longer. But until that time, you can continue to use EASE, continue to do what you have been doing up until this point. But the Turnitin portals will be available as a choice in that process, and it needs to be done and people aware of that choice when the subject outline is being drafted and published, because it involves some setup. There's some work, as we have a number of people in the room that have gone through that process of having to set those portals up. What else can I tell you? We've got some questions around how the subject outline tool will handle that process. Right now, we have to remove grade center columns that are redundant, for example. So there's some tweaking involved, and that's been a bit fiddly. We want to remove that for next session, so that when you create your Turnitin portals, that's all you need to worry about. That would be good. Brendan, you've got a question?
Yeah, when we merge sites across, does that come across when they come across from like last year's content, or do you have to create it again?
So I think you're talking about two different things here.
I'm probably not explaining myself very well.
When we say merging, we're talking about multiple cohorts all being brought into the one subject site.
I'll rephrase it again. So say if you're teaching the subject next year and you're just duplicating the site.
Import, export, gotcha.
Import, export. So does that old content come over? Does the old
Turnitin portal come over?
Over?
So the answer is no.
Okay.
It needs to be re-provisioned, because when we create Turnitin portals, what's happening behind the scenes in Turnitin.com is it's creating a new class, right, for that session against that identity.
Okay. Yep.
I mean, your comment about the use of the term merged is still valid though, because when we use a merged subject site, the one portal is accessed by all the students in the different cohorts. And maybe the next time we run this as well, we'll talk to Kirsten, who's got merged cohorts and marking groups set up within her subject site, because if you have any groups in I2, those groups will flow across into Turnitin as well. And so that's how they handle their markers, by setting up groups in the I2 site because she can use those same groups in Turnitin for marking, and it will actually split the cohort for marking teams, which is handy as well. All right, I realize I've done a whole bunch of talking as I want to do, and we've gone over time, but I'd just like to thank everyone for coming out this morning, for our instructors, Nicole, Kim, for joining us and sharing their experiences as well. And we look forward to seeing where Turnitin goes next session, when suddenly the lights go on for everybody if you want to use this. But otherwise, have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you at the next one. And I'll turn the recording off.